everybody, Gurmy's Coaster Yard here, and in today's episode of Germanator Studios, we are going to be putting in, yet again, more work on the Colonial section of our park. The primary thing we'll be doing in today's episode is building a restaurant. But before we do that, we are doing some work between our medieval section and the Halloween section in our little behind-the-scenes area. I realized that for whatever reason that building was not our favorite go-away green color, and I realized technically the little warehouse building is visible from atop the castle, right near those staircases, and I can't think of a good way to hide that, so I decided to make it go away green, and I also put some trees along there. Um, in theme parks, at least at Cedar Point, in my experience, it's not so common to see foliage and landscaping in areas that are inaccessible to guests. Um, However, where you can fit them in, I think it helps to improve the aesthetic, I guess, of your park, and I think it can just help. I don't know how to explain it, but in my mind, I think it makes sense to have a little bit of landscaping, even if it's just those trees, just to make the exteriors of buildings look nicer for employees and improve their morale. And then, of course, along here, I'm putting in some parking spaces, just for anyone who may be parking back there. And you can see where the blue lines are. I included a couple spaces that could be handicapped accessible. Um, and then just putting a little barrier in there to prevent cars from pulling too far forward. And then I put a little yellow line across here just to sort of denote that there's no parking beyond that point, and that's only for vehicles making deliveries. And in real life, I don't think the yellow line would denote that, but that's just sort of the idea I had when I built it. And then I had this big green area over here behind our Colonial section of the park, and I decided to pave over that and make a large employee parking lot. And I believe this is the first full-scale employee parking lot we've done. Um, I don't think we've done any full-scale parking aside from the parking garage we did a while back. Um, which reminds me, I still have not made that available, I don't believe, on RCT Go, so I should do that too. But anyway, and there were plenty of spots along here to include parking, which was nice, and I put some cars in a little bit too. Uh, but yeah, I guess back to the original idea I was getting across is, in my experience at Cedar Point, you don't see a whole lot in the way of landscaping in behind the scenes areas. In fact, I think the only place you really see it is on the borders, in order to mask those areas from guest view. Um, so my idea was just I had the extra space along the edges, so might as well do something with it. And so that's why I put the trees in next to the one building. And also, I think when those areas are visible from guests, it further sort of it further hides them from that guest perspective, and it also extends the theoretical border past any fences. Um, so if you have trees in an area where that that's behind fences that guests aren't supposed to see, those tree tops sort of sell the illusion that the forest or whatever it may be goes further back than just the fence, if that makes sense. But anyway, I guess at this point I'm starting to digress. So I put a couple more accessible parking spots in there, um, towards that one edge, and right here I was left with a little bit of extra space, so I just put a bush there. And that's all we do behind the scenes, for the most part in this episode. But for right now, we are getting started on our Colonial kitchen, and you can see here I'm trying to come up with a nice footprint that'll look good from the front, and eventually I settle on what you see here, for the main dining area. And the darker sort of cobblestone path behind there is, that's basically where I put the kitchen in the end, behind the scenes. And so of course we're continuing with the colonial theme with the colonial wall set. So I put in a small balcony along the front, just to get started with the facade. And And this is a pretty straightforward build, um, but it does take a little while. In fact, it takes the bulk of the episode to complete, just because there was quite a bit of nuance in making sort of a full-size restaurant and having enough seating the way I wanted to do it, and of course building the kitchen behind the scenes. Not that I do an interior for the kitchen, but just putting in those walls and making sure that space is present within the storyline of our park, um, just to make sure, just to maintain continuity. Anyhow, I don't remember where I was going with that exactly, but I decided after that to extend the balcony to be 2 stories tall, um, just to because I was gonna have this whole thing be 3 stories tall essentially. Um, and that will change eventually. That the balcony will change quite a lot actually in the final form. Um, but for now, we're just putting in some corner pieces to add some more texture to the build and to break things up a little bit. And next, I was trying to figure out how I wanted to approach building the roof over the main area. So as you can see, the main area um, is 3 stories tall, and the side to the wings of the building are 2 stories tall. Of course, the building itself is only going to be 1 floor, um, with everything on the ground floor. But the height is just to add, obviously, more space on the inside and make it feel more open, as well as um, to make it look good from the outside. But nevertheless, we are putting in some pathways along here on the inside, basically everywhere that we can. You'll notice I left a couple spots by the entrance open, and I did that because I didn't want the pathways connecting to the ones on the outside through the windows. I only wanted them going through the doorways. And finally, we had enough space for 5 stalls, so I put 5 stalls in here. And because this is a large scale sit down restaurant, and this is sort of the first restaurant of this size at the park, we only have a couple other sit down restaurants. But I wanted to make sure there were plenty of food options. And I'm trying to look here to remember what all I put in, but I believe I chose a steakhouse as one of the options. I did chicken, we had fries and a drink stall, and then for dessert we have an ice cream stall in the end. And you can see me now sort of setting all of those things, all the stalls to those different types. Um, of course, yeah, and of course it's good to have options and variety for your guests to choose from, and I try to pick things that I have not used elsewhere in the park as well. So I think we did have an ice cream stall in the medieval section, but at the same time, it is a theme park, so you gotta have ice cream in multiple locations. But generally speaking, I try to break it up, and I try to use things that I haven't used yet, and also things that I don't think I will use anywhere else in the park. So, for instance, you could say maybe I failed in this respect. Um, that a steakhouse could also work in the western section of the park, um, but I think I have some plans to get away with not having to do that, or doing it differently if I do. Anyhow, now you can see we're using our little booth technique to place benches back to back facing each other. That was an oxymoron, wasn't it? Uh, but if you saw the episode where we made the diner, and we also did this in for the restaurant in the prehistoric section of the park, um, the it's the same technique where you raise one tile of pathway that way you can put benches on it facing however you like, and then you can lower it back down to the height of the other paths and benches, and it makes for an effect that resembles a booth. Unfortunately, of course, there are no tables for you to place on the pathways, but that's a just an effective technique from an aesthetic standpoint. And I found a little bit more of an efficient way to place these in this back section so it didn't take as long. I was a little more prepared for the placements because I had figured it out on the other side. And just closing off that wall. And with that, also I have a couple doorways to place. And after that, what are we doing? Ah, yes. So I wanted this restaurant because it's so tall and has so many windows. It's going to be bright on the inside. So I decided to put some planters on the inside. Um, so I used the I don't remember what they're called, like the wall end pieces or whatever, to create nice sort of decorative planters. And then I went through and found a tree I liked. I think it was the lime tree or whatever, the small something lime. I don't remember, but I thought that one looked nice, and it felt like the right height and sort of density for the area. It was not too big and not too filled out, and I thought it worked well as a nice indoor plant. So that's what I settled on. And of course, now we're placing lighting throughout. And I noticed this back wall was a little barren. Just a tall, flat wall with no windows. And because we were going to have a kitchen behind there, we couldn't really have much in the way of windows anyway. So I decided to add a little roof over the stalls, and I should say ceiling over the stalls. And then I just used those wall end pieces to create a nice little decorative pattern. And after that, I was experimenting with seeing if I could put a planter up there, but I couldn't quite get it to work the way I wanted to. So I ended up settling for some lights, and I thought that was fine because we could light up that back wall and just make the place brighter in the nighttime, and that would be just as good as having some plants up there. And finally, we are starting to work on the roof for the building. Um, I went through a couple designs before I found one I liked. I didn't like having all the dormer windows up there, and the I can't remember what the other ones are called that are like dormers, but it's just an end piece. But I don't really care for those, in because the function I think they're supposed to serve is splitting water when it's raining over top of a doorway, to keep people getting wet who are walking out the door. But there were no doors underneath them, so they were kind of pointless. So I deleted all that and placed the two dormer windows that you see now and finished off that roof as it is. And then along this other side, I placed roofs in a mostly normal way. And there you can see I used um, that sort of piece I was talking about over top of where the doors are on either side. And those are just sort of emergency exit doors, more or less, or just alternate exits for when guests are finished eating. Um, but I use those over tops. That way, if it is raining, again, guests will not get wet when they are walking out. Well, they'll get wet, but it won't be from an excess of water sliding off the roof. Anyhow, that's it for the main restaurant structure. So now it is time to go along and do more detail work along the outside. And here you can see me deleting the balconies and extending them. And I started to place them 2 stories tall, but at some point along here, I realized on the wings, it doesn't make sense to have them 2 stories tall when there's only 1 story that can have a balcony. So I end up just making them 1 story tall, and I think that looks a lot nicer in the end. And then it's time for the landscaping around the outside. And I was trying to come up with a thing to do, and I ended up settling on the roses and the flower beds that we have done elsewhere in the park. But you'll notice I didn't put the roses in front of the windows. Um, and I didn't do that because they sort of block the windows quite a bit, and I wanted the windows to remain mostly open. So instead, I will just place full flower beds in front of those. Now you'll notice I'm using the small flower beds where the roses are, and that's because everywhere else we have full-size tiles that are open. So I was able to use the large flower beds and save a little bit of time. Um, Another thing to note is that I could not use the hedge piece as normal because of the present. You can't place the hedge on the edges of the pathways whatsoever, not even with M Brooks. So, and because of the way the balconies work, actually, I think they're terraces technically. I should make that distinction. But because of the way they work, um, the, you or I lost my train of thought now. Anyway, because of the way they work, that edge was unavailable to place the hedge piece. So I had to be a little creative and make a little wall instead. And I think it worked just fine. I used the block wall from the colored wall set and gave it a gray color. And I think it fits really nicely with the build. And now where those little exit pathways are, I'm placing an additional wall. And of course, I'm leaving one tile of space between the path and that wall. That way we can extend a tree line along there and create a nice natural barrier. And you've heard me talk about natural barriers before, and I will stand by them as just a good way to break up or to border your areas, your behind the scenes areas, um, and it makes everything flow a lot smoother too. Anyhow, now that we have completed the maybe okay, I lied. I got ahead of myself there. We're doing a little more work up front. In that open tile where there was a support coming down, I placed a fence instead of a hedge piece, just so employees can access that little access pathway to the behind the scenes area. Then I placed a frog fountain up front, just to have something nice and elegant in front that's not a planter, because the planter would have gone right up to the entrance, and I didn't want it sort of obstructing that facade or that view. Anyhow, now moving along to the back, um, this is where I got ahead of myself before. I recolored those tiles to be just a proper concrete color instead of the slate, now that we didn't need to differentiate. And then one tile in from the edges, I built up a wall too high. And I just went one tile in just to make sure that the kitchen wasn't visible from inside the park. And because it's not part of that structure, that architectural theme. And then along here, similar to how we've done it before, we are just placing some coolers and a freezer alongside the edge of the kitchen. And that's pretty straightforward how I do that. And putting some exits in as well. And I bordered them with red to try and differentiate them from the freezers. But then I realized when I moved that exit a little further from the freezer, I could just color the walls gray, and it would be more clear. And in a realistic setting, it would be clear because the freezers actually have like a big gray, shiny, metallic door, and the exits is just a normal door, and there would be exit signage as well. So I decided I didn't need to be too hyper focused on making those exits realistic. And here I was just going through and trying to find where I did another freezer slash cooler just to make sure that they were consistent across the board. And I ended up finding the one that I did for the dinosaur restaurant right there. You just saw it on the screen. The only difference is that these ones are 1 block wide and 2 blocks deep, whereas the other ones I've done were just 1 block wide and 1 block deep. And then going in for the roof and the air conditioning units, putting them on top of the freezer and cooler and on top of the roof. And that completes the restaurant and kitchen. And we have one more clip here. Ah yes, just extending that little border wall. This is mostly just some fine tuning and extending those trees behind the scenes as well. And I don't remember what else we do because I think this is really just the small little details. Ah, yes. But I will say I ended up naming the kitchen. I called it Revere's Colonial Kitchen. I had another kitchen called Colonial Kitchen in another park, and I liked the name of it. So I decided to run with it. And that's obviously the title for this episode as well. So with that, we're coming up on the end. But we're not quite there yet, so I don't know what else to talk about. These are just small little details, but I'm going to wish you all a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next episode. Goodbye.